Daniel Cramer is a jazz musician and performer working in Western Canada and has been active as an electronic musician for many years. Graduating from his studies in music at university in the early 1980s, Daniel took great interest in the electronic music studio on campus and became their first student to employ computers in the art of music making. It was these early years that nurtured Daniel's love of modular electronic instruments, and while working as a performing musician and studio engineer and producer, he began to build his own experimental electronic studio. Fast forward to the 2000s, and Daniel was excitedly riding the wave of modular resurgence. Now a well-known artist in the Eurorack modular music making scene, Daniel Cramer is best recognized for his work on large-scale, complex patches that delve into polyphonic renderings of Barton's ubiquitous Krell and multi-layered generative patches that can take months to design and hours to unfold. Cramer's release Exodus was recorded live in the Netherlands while performing at Colin Bender's Museum of Sound, and his recent release, A Rush of Souls, was composed for an artist in residency program in Estonia in 2020. Detailed explanations of these and other works can be found on Daniel Cramer's YouTube channel, where he endeavors to share his artistic processes with other like-minded musicians. And here he is, Daniel Cramer.
Yeah, hi. How are you? I'm fine. I'm fine. Nice to have you. Nice to have you in my talk. Something is with my earphones. Okay, now I'm hearing you again.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I was, and I am still looking forward to our talk. I asked, my wife asked me, who is it today? And I said, how shall I? Oh, you are gone. Your picture is gone.
I'll try and come back. There we
go. Yeah, okay. And my wife asked me, and I said, how shall I describe it? It's Mr. Krellberg Variations.
Yes.
Yeah, it's morning in Canada right now, right?
Yeah, just before lunchtime, just an hour before lunch. But where I am, which is quite far south and west, the sun is high and it's nice and warm.
I see.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so let's jump right into it.
Sure.
First question about computers. Do computers play a role in your production process, and if, what kind of?
Yeah, I'm currently using Macs and have been since about 2008, I think, 2007. And the reason that I switched over to Macs was historically I've used a program called Logic, and I don't want to betray my age, but I started a long time ago on Atari computers and became very used to and a huge fan of a program called Creator and Notator from Germany. I was running those on the Atari, and I actually had an interesting thing. I had a very rare copy of Logic Audio running on an Atari Falcon. It was never released, but I had a semi-working release version. And then they ported it over to PC. So in the early 2000s, I was running PCs just to be able to run Logic Audio on PCs. And then Apple bought the product when the two software designers retired. And then Apple ported it only to the Mac. And so then the only reason I bought Mac was to continue to use that software. And so and then I followed it. I've basically been following that software everywhere. So earlier on, prior to getting into hardware modular, which for me happened about 2012, I was very, very heavy into software. And I was really excited about software modulars and soft synths. I had lots of them. At one point, I had a job selling those sorts of things. I ran a big music shop, so I had access to a lot of software. And eventually, like so many others, I started to tire of it. I found the sound of it fatiguing. I could never get it to sound the way I liked. And at that period, even though there were some great VSTs and soft synths that emulated synthesizers, they didn't quite sound like them, and they certainly didn't give you the control. There was really nothing that was modular like the kinds of software modulars we see now. And I think in some ways that was lucky for me. If I had a chance to get into something like VCV or some of these newer programs back then, it's possible I may have gone that route and never started to collect hardware modules. But eventually I just couldn't take it anymore. My dream had always been to have a big hardware modular. And so finally, by about 2012, I started collecting Eurorack.
Okay, and actually, the combination of hardware modules and some kind of software, how does it run in?
So in my studio, I'm really only using the Mac and the software as a recording tool. It's kind of my recording arranging tool. And I do work on other kinds of projects as well. So I use the score notation and things. But really, if I'm working on a piece of modular music, it's running on the modular system completely. Mixer, effects, everything is all happening in hardware.
All right. Just by the way, I'm still the lucky owner of 2 functionable Atari 1040, I think, ST with creator notator, with notator.
Oh, amazing, amazing. Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah. All right. Well, another thing. Away from technical things. You're a studied musician, and it's not that often that studied musicians end up as you have. So what is the relation of, let's say, or what role does what you have learned, what you have studied, play in your actual production of music right now?
Well, it does certainly play a role. And I think part of its biggest role is that it helps me hone in on where I want to go, you know, especially in terms of the forms, the overall forms that I'm creating, the actual makeup, the actual note pitch makeup, rhythms and things. It really helps inform those decisions on a macro and a micro level. But I think where it's most useful is it helps to keep me from falling into traps. And I'm always encouraging musicians, be they new or old, to learn more about music theory and scales, because then they can begin to understand how so much of what they're creating by ear can be very, very similar, and that it can be helpful to be able to break out of boxes and patterns by seeing them and by understanding what they are.
I see. Sometimes I hear the opinion, well, that what I have learned, especially when it's really has been a studying at university or something like that. Sometimes I hear it that people say, hey, what I have learned, it's, I wouldn't know this. Can you understand it?
Yeah, as if to say that what they've learned hasn't been that influential, like it hasn't had a big impact. For me, I think at first maybe that was the case, and I was a performing musician for many years and still am. And I play a lot of regular popular music, jazz music, and all kinds of things. I made my living doing that. I was a record producer and owned a studio and a record label. So I think it's taken a lot of years for all that information that I learned those many years ago to kind of sift through me. Where it's probably had its biggest impact has been in looking at music from far away and looking at modular music from far away. I hope that that's apparent in the kinds of patches, the kinds of pieces that I create, where I'm really looking at it from a big picture, and I'm trying to create music that changes over time the way that a major work, you know, by a significant classical artist might have.
I see. By the way, I've read you make your own modules as well, right?
Well, Not really. I have made a couple of little utilities. I'm fascinated by DIY. I'm just not very good at it. And I'm always, I'm part of a group on Mondays. I meet with some fairly well-known designers in the Western United States and Canada. And I'm fascinated by these really intelligent, really capable people who can take an idea or take a mathematical formula and execute it as a circuit and then build and test it themselves. And I just don't have that skill level. I really wish that I did. My father taught me electronics years ago, and I just never stuck. I just don't have the skill. My soldering skills are so bad that I'll burn a hole in the studio floor. So I can fix, guitars and things, but I'm not really going to be able to do very much myself, which is a pity because I have a lot of design ideas. I think what's fascinating about what's going on in the modular marketplace with regard to DIY is that this is where musicians can go and buy instruments that were designed by less than a room full of people. When I was selling musical instruments, I had a chance to visit companies like Yamaha and Roland and Sonic and to participate in how it is that they design the instruments that they make. And one of the things I learned is that they design them with a room full of engineers and marketing people. And so they're trying to hit a price point, and they're trying to throw in a bunch of features. So it's just a big conglomerate of ideas, and they all end up looking really similar. And for a long time, that's what the state of modern synthesizer keyboards looked like. And then along comes some designers, guys historically like Moog or Buchla or Serge, and they have one singular vision, and they're able to create instruments based on their own singular vision. And we're seeing the modern equivalent of that now. A good example of that is, and it's up here, I am the owner of the original Eurorack Freak Shift designed by Dave Dixon, who designs analog modules for Canada's IntelliGel, that big module maker. And so he had created a design that is a frequency shifter, but he did it in a different way without an internal oscillator. So you have to use an external oscillator, but that immediately makes it capable of doing so many different things. And you can use it in so many different ways. And that's become quite a popular module that he's selling, right out of his own shop. But I guess my point is that as a designer, he was able to create that based on his own ideas and in his own workshop, testing his own. And I think that that's been a real boon to the modular world. Part of what's so great about modular is not only can you go buy the individual pieces you want, but you're buying individual pieces that just wouldn't be available anywhere else.
I see. By the way, quite a lot of people are looking very interested at the absolutely old studio equipment from the 1950s and very early 1960s. What's your relation to these, let's say, nostalgic things?
Years ago, I actually had someone. We had the recording studio and the record label in the 90s. In the early 90s, we had some of that. We had test oscillators. That stuff fascinated me. And then I got into a piece of software called Berna Studio. I think it's an Italian guy, Cristofiore, his name, and he codes this amazing software emulation of one of those studios. And I'm fascinated by the old videos of those workshops and the old Stockhausen stuff. And I studied that when I studied electronic music years ago. In the early 80s, I had studied all of that. I love the Heimbach videos where he takes you through all those.
Nice guy.
For myself, there's no way that I could collect that much. I would need so much to do anything like what I'm doing in Eurorack. But I think the other thing that's kind of keeps me away from it is that there isn't a lot of intercontrol. Like it doesn't have the same kind of control voltage connectivity that we get in modern systems. And that's a huge part of what I do, is the way that modules are controlled amongst themselves. But it is something that I'm fascinated by, the sound of them and the giant you know, the giant pieces of equipment. It's amazing stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think also there's something, another aspect quite interesting and important in that it let's say increases the consciousness of sound itself. Not that musical melody, rhythm, and things like that, but just what is sound? How does it work? How does it feel when a simple sine wave can be immensely interesting, dealt with in the right way? And I think these things are important to work with. Well.
Yeah, yeah, and I am quite a fan of some of the modern composers, like, well, the innovator of the original Krell patch, Todd Barton, Doug Linner, you know, some of these guys who are creating some Buchla-based patches that are really just evolving sounds, and it's about this deep listening, you know, and that kind of stuff fascinates me. I think it's hard to do well. And it's something that I want to get more into. I'm hoping to do a whole series of short pieces based on that. It's always been something I've wanted to do, but it's also easy for me to do pieces that are based more in rhythm and have some, you know, melodic stuff and scales and things, right? So it's a kind of a trade-off, but definitely it's almost like a new folk music where sound itself, the actual emergent quality of changing sound had become fascinating.
Another thing, perhaps even older, even older, Musik concrete, field recording, working with field recordings and implementing it in music. What's your stand with that?
That's also something that I studied long ago, and I'm fascinated by the history of that and the way that Musik concrete made its way into early rock and roll music.
Yeah.
The old classic rock and roll. It's amazing how that kind of work perpetuated itself throughout our whole culture. I have worked with it, but what I tend to do is I tend to use the source material, the sounds, as ways to create voltage. So, for example, I'm very fortunate to have an almost complete, it's just down here, Doepfer modular vocoder. Hard to source and very, very rare here in Canada. But one of the things that it does that's so nice is you can pass any kind of sound through its input preamp and then derive multiple envelopes from different frequency bands as the first of vocoding. So I'll often use that technique to pull out voltages from some kind of changing sounds in nature or, you know, recordings and things.
Okay. Another quite special segment of the music, perhaps even music instrument market, are the so-called semi-modular things. And one big argument, of course, are the costs. If you have 10 modules in Eurorack, you have to pay 10 times the amount.
Yeah.
How do you use semi-modulars? What do you think about it?
I don't use any of them. I have none of them left, and I'm not a big fan of them. But when I say that, it's because when I was younger and I was living in the prairies of Canada, it was very, very hard to find modular. You couldn't buy it anywhere. You couldn't even see one. And even in the universities and the colleges, most of what you saw was actually semi. And everything that I owned when I was younger and starting patching in the 90s was done on things like the MS-20, the MS-10. I had the Roland System 100, the semi-modular keyboard. That's a sort of a green-gray with an expander. Really, really nice system. And what I ended up doing was buying a lot of those. I had a room full of those. So I had multiple, you know, copies of the MS-20 and the MS-10, the Roland gear, multiple Roland sequencers, and I was patching all of that and making generative music. Some of my earliest pieces that are on my Bandcamp were actually created in that way. Now, that stuff sounded great, and it was a lot of fun to play with, but it was frustrating because there were certain things that you just couldn't do. And so I think of semi-modular as those frustrations, and that's the only reason now is because I've done so much of it. But the fact that it's become an explosion and that you can now buy an MS-20, that's amazing. I never would have thought that stuff would make such a big comeback.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest, from my way of producing music, the biggest minus points of semi-modular is that you get always only a few VCAs. Yeah, mostly one synth has one VCA and that's it, if you are lucky too. Yeah, and then you have a lot of VCOs, having, let's say, 10 semi-modulars, price is possible, but then you have a lot of VCOs sounding more or less the same and only very, very few VCAs. That's a bit of a problem, I think.
Yeah, and the other thing is that there's a tendency for them to be hardwired between the oscillator filters, and you can never undo that. You know, and that's why I would end up with more than one.
Yeah,
because
sure.
That's something externally into the filter of an MS-20 and use the oscillators from another one to do something else. And yeah.
You mentioned VCV at the beginning, and or voltage modular VCV and things like that. Do you work with these things?
No, I'm always looking at it and I'm always thinking, if I start to work with it, because that was a piece of software I've always wanted. I dreamed of that software. You know, and I was beta testing some other software and apps on the iPad 10 years ago, and even more. I always wanted to see a piece of software like that. So I worry now if I get into it that it'll just consume all my time. And I'm trying to spend less time in front of the Mac, you know, not more time. But it seems to have really done well. Like from what I've heard from people that use it, is they'll often log into it. They'll often use it to test modules before they buy them, or to test out patches and do. But so far, I haven't really tried it.
Yeah, I'm thinking of setting up something hybrid, using hardware, and then this, I think Erica Synths or somebody has the conversion module so that I can communicate between my soft synths on the PC and my hardware. All right, well, let's enter another field, the field of quite difficult questions, talking about music, especially your music, of course. And my first question sounds quite harmless, but okay, we will see. Do you follow certain rules when you set up your patches, when you develop your pieces?
Yes, I do, but I may rewrite the rules for every piece or for a series. So, for example, the latest piece I'm working on, and the patch is still running here back in my studio, the Krellberg Variations is based on a 13-voice polyphonic generative kind of orchestra, if you will. And although it's loosely based on Barton's Krell patch, there really is only one Barton Krell that creates the actual melody voice. The rest of it are these kind of my own version of it, where they're interlocked and they tend to do very different kinds of things, but they have that organic envelope shape. What I decided when I was working on the Krell Variations, and the reason it's called Variations, is that I was going in a few different directions. So in the video series, of which there's only 2 left, and then I will finally have finished, I show the viewer some different ways that I could have gone, and then I make some hard decisions and I leave the patch in a certain state. And my plan was to then create music from that. So one of the rules that I follow is that the form of the piece is based on blocks of time that are the same length. And a lot of times what I do is I will create a form that are based on blocks of time that are the same number of notes. So I'll use clock dividers and counters. So once it's played, say, 180 notes, then it goes to the next section. And so if it's going faster, then that'll be shorter. If 180 notes takes 5 minutes, then that whole section is 5 minutes. So one of my rules in the Krellberg Variations is I use a separate clock that I tune to be a certain number of minutes, around 10 minutes or so. And then there'll be 8 steps throughout that 10-minute chunk.
I see.
The other rule is that the whole thing is sequenced. There's a lot of random things going on, and there's a lot of sample and holds going on to create all of the melodic stuff and to create the actual changing functions for the Krell envelopes, of which there's lots. There's lots of VCAs envelopes, and there's so much going on in that patch. And eventually I'll do like a count off. I'll explain how much of what.
Great.
Making it up. It's a big patch. It's 467 patch cables. I believe it's the largest patch ever documented. I've never seen such a big patch. So it was so, and it's amazing that I retired recently, so I had enough time to actually go through this thing step by step.
Yeah.
It was a real labor of love. So then the other important rule that I follow is once I program it, and I program it by making up these little scores, these are the actual sections too. And then in there, I put in the voltages or the scales or, the knob numbers that I want. Once it's set up, it runs without my interference. I don't need to do it. There's no place that I'm reaching and changing. So what I do is I let it run in the studio. It takes about an hour or two to program in another one of these scores. And then I have multiple scores. So then what I do is I record a few passes of this looping through, and this might be 8 minutes long, and then I stop that, and then I record a few passes of the next page in the score after I've set it up. So 2 hours of work, changing all the settings and letting it run. So the whole patch is running all day as I do this. Then I record 3 or 4 passes of that, and then I do the next one. And depending on each of these is what I consider a movement. It's its own unique musical idea. Then what I do is I go back and I have a listen to all of those, and then I choose the ones that I find the most musically engaging. And as we all know from working with generative and recording generative patches, as soon as you stop recording, suddenly it does something amazing. And it's like, oh my God, I stopped recording. I missed it. It happens all the time. So I've gotten the recording, I might record an hour or half an hour of one of these running, and then I can tell, like suddenly everything clicks. It's like the machine comes alive and everything sounds so great. And then I go back and that's the one I use. The other rule for the Krellberg variations is that each of these scores, each of these movements only appears in the finished piece once. So that what you're listening to is always unique material. First you hear this, and then you hear this, and then you hear the next one. So I have released 2 of the albums so far, and they're on my Bandcamp. Both, and when you look at my Bandcamp, you see them up there, and it looks like 2 of the same album, because it almost is. The album is called What the Mountain Said, based on the Krellberg Variations, and they're in 4 movements. So you see 4 pieces of music that are almost the same length, and then listening through it takes you through the whole piece. The only difference between the first realization, which is 1 album, and the second realization, which is the second album, is that I chose different recordings of the same performance. So it's the same electronic score, but recorded at a different time in the same recording session. I did them all done in a single day. And it's interesting to hear how the same generative patch creates a slightly different piece of music. So it's almost like chaos theory. I've set up the conditions at the beginning, and then the machine runs through it, producing the musical output, but in different ways every time that it does it.
I see.